Time to go lights out with Deb Williams. And Deb, we used to just call you NASCAR writer. Now we can call you Hall of Famer. Deb, we always try to go out and do the best job we can, but when you get an award as prestigious as the Squire Hall of Fame Award, which you just recently given, it's got to give you some validation of your career. Does it give you a great feeling that all those hours and all those days, all that work is being recognized properly?
It does, but at the same time, it really doesn't feel real. It may become real to me once they start asking for my items to go into the display case. Yeah. But, I've been shocked and pleasantly surprised at how many people have wished me well and congratulatory. I mean, people that I haven't heard from in a long time. So it's like one person looked at me and said, "You've dedicated your whole life to this sport." And I never really had thought of it that way until she said that to me in the Darlington Media Center. It was Lee Spencer who said that to me. And I thought back about the sacrifices that I had made since I had decided at age 13, this is what I wanted to do. And it is still unbelievable to me.
I think, Deb, we're doing pretty well in terms of the sport in general. In terms of diversity, there are now more women riders. There are now more women drivers that are up and coming. I think we've made good strides in that. But when you first started, I think, Deb, you were a true trailblazer. You were one of the first. What was the reaction like when you really went in? I mean, nowadays people are going in, women sports writers are going into a male-dominated sport, but when you started, it really was a male-dominant sport. What was the reaction you got from the people involved?
Well, I was fortunate at the time in that I worked for an international wire service. I worked for United Press International, and, then you had the Associated Press and you had UPI. And everybody wanted the coverage from the two wire services because they had access to all the newspapers, radio, and TV stations all over the world. And that helped me considerably, was the fact that I was the UPI person. But a lot of people didn't know quite how to take me. And, once they learned that I was truly interested in the sport and the cars and the workings of the engines and everything, it made it a lot nicer. And the fact that Richard Petty would stop and talk to me in the garage and help me get validation there. And with the veteran sports writers like Gerald Martin at the Raleigh paper, Tom Higgins at the Charlotte Observer, back then we didn't have, the only time we had formal press conferences was when somebody was announcing a driver change or a sponsor. And there were no lounges in the transporters. That's where they hauled the engines. And there were no motor coaches. Everybody stayed in the same hotels and traveled on the same commercial flights. And you got your stories by building the relationships. And you sat on the back of the transporters and stood on tires and sat on tires and all. And the fact that those veteran sports writers let me be with them when it was a group session. And like I said, Richard Petty would talk to me. And then when Linda Petty was president of the Winston Cup Racing Wives Auxiliary, and they used to always have an annual fashion show at Burdine's during Speed Weeks at Daytona at the Volusia Mall. And I had gone over there to interview Dick Brooks's wife, Stephanie, at the time, for a story. And, the fact that Linda Petty said, "Oh, I've known Debbie since she was just this high," that helped say, "Oh, well, if Linda Petty says she's okay, she's okay." So all of that combined helped. But, some of the horror stories that I heard from other women who were married to crew chiefs or married to drivers and all, and how they tried to keep Stevie Waltrip out of the pits when Darrell wanted her to keep the fuel charts. They made her buy a crewman license. They thought that if they did that, they wouldn't like the fact that it was taken away from a crew person. Then it was taking them down one, but it didn't work. So, but the fact that I was with an international wire service helped me tremendously.
Deb, other than the King, who else were the guys? Who were the main stars of the sport when you started out? Who were the first guys you talked to?
Cale Yarborough, Bobby Allison. It was really hard for me because these were the drivers that I had grown up watching and admiring as a fan. And now I was having to go in and question them as drivers and me as a journalist. And it was difficult at first. But David Pearson was winding down his career at the time. And Darrell Waltrip was on the upswing. There was Neil Bonnet. Ricky Rudd was just getting started. So was Rusty Wallace and Dale Earnhardt. And we were all about the same age of as far as Ricky and Rusty and Dale and all. But yeah, it was Bobby Allison and Cale Yarborough, David Pearson, Richard Petty during when I first started covering for UPI in 1979.
So when I look back at when I got my start, Deb, there were a couple drivers in particular that really were extra friendly. I didn't know everything I wanted to know about the sport, and I probably asked a lot of questions. But there were guys that were out there that meant a lot to me. Jeff Gordon was one of them. Greg Biffle was one as well that really I thought took a little bit extra interest in the 90s of helping me out. Were there drivers or owners in particular that you feel like you can go back to and credit them with your development into what you were able to become?
Well, one was Robert Yates. And the thing about Robert Yates, once a lot of these people found out that my dad was a machinist and that I was interested in the mechanical end of the cars, then they would take a lot of time with me. And Robert Yates would always explain the new heads that were coming out from Ford and the new engines and all. Johnny Hayes was great to work with the Skull Bandit teams. Humpy Wheeler was a fantastic mentor. He was always there.
Oh, yeah.
And there were people, not necessarily drivers and team owners, but people who guided and coached me. Jim Hunter at NASCAR, Bob Latford, who just designed the point system that we used up until 2004. Gene Granger, who put together all the statistics for the R.J. Reynolds tobacco record books. And, it was the little things like Bob Latford, the first time I went to cover Speed Weeks. And Bob said, well, everybody knows you're with UPI here in the Carolinas, but when you go to Daytona, you need to make you a name tag that says Deb Williams, United Press International, or UPI, so that if somebody's looking for the wire service person, they know who it is and where to find you.
So, Deb, what have you seen in terms of places you have worked for? I think just the other day to hear what major newspapers have gone away from a printed edition. There were such great magazines that were out there, and wire services and motorsports information services that were out there. Which ones that you worked for have gone away since? Actually, pretty recently, I think we've lost some entities that have been around motorsports forever.
Yes, that's true. Actually, UPI went from being a wire service to it's an internet. Now you can go on and read UPI articles on the UPI website. But NASCAR, I think a lot of people probably know it as NASCAR Scene. It started out as Grand National Scene and then became Winston Cup Scene and then was NASCAR Winston Cup Scene the 10 years that I was editor of it. But I was there 18 years and the editor for the last 10 years that I was there. And it shut down 7 years after I left. And then Illustrated, which was a sister publication, and it was a magazine, it shut down. Not really sure when it shut down, quite honestly. But it was several years after Scene shut down. And, it's really sad. I know a lot of people talk about the harshness of the social media and the terrible stuff that's read on Twitter a lot of times, or X, whichever way you want to identify it. And that's actually what we saw in letters to the editor when they came in. The difference is now that you don't have anyone who's been trained in libel and slander law and had communications law that's able to filter out the derogatory and filthy comments that people make. And I think that's a shame that we are losing the print media the way we are. Unfortunately, I mean, I was told in journalism school that within 30 years we would have something called the internet, and that's the way people would get their information then. So I don't understand why the media outlets were not prepared for it, because they knew it was coming. I don't know if they didn't think it people would gravitate to it or what, but there was no excuse for them to be caught as off guard as they were.
Yeah, and also, Deb, I think one of the things that has changed, I think when you and me were both early on in our careers, there was something called accountability, and there was something called, you had to have a source of what you were saying, and you had to be able to back it up, or you're going to get drummed out of the sport. But it just seems like with all these outlets that we've lost a little bit of that accountability. That you're really able nowadays. I mean, some of the stuff you read on Facebook and X or Twitter, it's like, the story's false because we're in the garage area. That's not right, but yet people are still putting it out and getting away with it. I don't know what your take is on that, but I think it's that lack of accountability that has changed sports journalism and really journalism as a whole in a big way.
Well, that's true. And unfortunately, what a lot of people are interested in is not the truth or being accountable, as you said, but rather clickbait so they can get the clicks. And I know that I've even heard some of the stories have been AI generated. So,
wow.
It's more like, let's just see how sensational we can be and what we can come up with. And unfortunately, a lot of people think, okay, I can create a website and that makes me a journalist, or I can create a YouTube and that makes me a journalist. And they've never had any training in the profession, and they've never had a course in communications law and that accountability that you're talking about. Now, they don't know the difference between a column, a news story, and a feature. I mean, I can remember having editors. In fact, the first managing editor I had, he was emphatic about, you are not the story. Your job, there's a story in everybody out there, and your job is to find it.
Yep, absolutely. And boy, weren't there stories along the way. I think I spent a lot of time, Deb, in the stick and ball sports. And the one thing that I thought was was refreshing doing NASCAR full time was the fact that these guys, they didn't really have anything guaranteed. You go to NFL, NBA, these guys have guaranteed contracts, so they don't have to talk to the media. They don't have to market themselves. A driver, I think, has to market him or herself in a certain way and to therefore be a brand ambassador. I think that's one of the things over the years that has helped us so much in terms of bringing out those stories you talk about, of getting them, because the drivers wanted to be an open book and the owners wanted to be an open book. And that was one of the really great things about covering NASCAR.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And that's the reason I enjoy covering the NHRA too, is because the competitors at the NHRA are really open to the media the way the NASCAR competitors were in the 1980s. And, they don't have so many demands on them and this and that all week long. And, but it's interesting you bring that up, because one time I was working with an advancement teaching, the state of North Carolina had a program for teachers where they could come in and learn the different careers that were available in racing. And one of the teachers asked me why it seemed like the drivers didn't mismanage their money as much as some of the athletes in stick and ball sports. And I said, well, it's because they've had to work so hard for so long and do so much with so little. Of a lot of times they just don't go out and splurge with it. They know how to manage their money better. So yeah, it's entirely different, because I don't think a lot of people know or either lose sight of the fact that drivers are independent contractors, and they have a contract with the team owner. They have a personal services contract with the sponsor and or with the manufacturer. And it's not where they're in there and guaranteed by a league. I know. I remember when Kyle Petty was driving, he had a insurance contract with Lloyd's of London, and I've had wives that told me back before corporate America came in, where a driver had a guaranteed salary for a year, it was difficult for them to get a mortgage loan because the banks didn't want to give to it because they didn't have a guaranteed salary. It was, 40% of their winnings. Well, how much were you going to win? Were you going to get hurt? What was going to happen? And so it was a difficult time for them.
Deb, you've been up front. You had a front row seat to some of the huge changes of this sport. Not too long ago, we went from cigarettes to cell phones, and you went from this southeastern sport with the rough and tumble, gritty guy behind the wheel, and now you're seeing a little bit more corporate money. Well, of course, you're seeing corporate money as the sport becomes more expensive. Some of those changes. Deb, let's start out with just, when the major TV contract happened back in 2001. What was that the change like from your perspective? Was that bringing the sport to the forefront? Was that more of a good change? Was there more negativity about it than it was? How was How were these changes that you saw?
Well, I can remember the first thing that the teams were upset about was the fact that the fans were going to be able to listen to their radio communications.
Yep.
And they didn't like that at all. Now nobody thinks about turning on a scanner, but at that particular time, they didn't want the fans listening in on their radio communications. So I remember there was a lot of uproar about that. And there was also where NASCAR had sent out a document that you always have to sign, the release form, for your hard card. And some people were just signing it and sending it back. But I know it was actually what was given NASCAR their intellectual property rights. Well, I remember Dale Earnhardt scratched out some things he didn't like in it and initialed them and then sent it back. I think Dave Marcus did the same. And then we suddenly noticed that they had listed on there that they owned all the interviews that we did at the track. And that, if what we couldn't write features from them or whatever and sell them anywhere else without NASCAR's permission. And I remember Mike Hembry made a comment. He said, the way this is written, if you have a baby in the infield during the race, NASCAR owns the child. Maybe we could make them pay for their college education. But when that came out and when reporters started refusing to sign it, NASCAR actually got into negotiations with the attorneys because the newspapers we worked for were copyrighted. Well, they owned our stuff. NASCAR didn't own it. Didn't matter if it was a photograph or a story. The newspaper we worked for, the magazine we worked for, owned it. So at that time, Knight Ridder still owned the Charlotte Observer, Miami Herald, Columbia, South Carolina Paper, a lot of others. And the attorneys for Knight Ridder and USA Today, Gannett, all got into negotiating with NASCAR over that phrase being in there because the phrase was that they owned it for perpetuity. Well, you can't own something that somebody else has a copyright on. That's the closest the media has ever come to boycotting the Daytona 500. They finally got it settled. I want to say about Friday. That's when it was a week long. You had Daytona 500 qualifying on one weekend and the 500 on the next. And there were reporters that had started driving to Daytona. They got phone calls from their newspapers telling them to turn around and come home.
Wow. That's interesting. And also, if at that time, Deb, in your early career, if I would have looked at you and said, hey, guess what, Deb, someday there's going to be a guy that's going to be running for the championship, and he's also going to have a lawsuit against the sanctioning body. I understand things happen in business and they're a little strange, but right now we're looking at something like that. I know you spend a lot of your time, Deb, researching and looking into this sort of thing. What is your take in general on where this lawsuit is between 2311 and NASCAR, and where is it going? Are we going to find some common ground and make this thing go away, or could this be as bad as some people are saying it is?
I think it's going to be as bad as some people are saying, for the simple reason that currently, after being in the hearing last Thursday, the two parties remind me of two mules that have dug in their heels, bared their teeth, and laid their ears back. And what people are missing, they're so focused on the charters that I think everybody needs to go back and read the original complaint very closely, because if NASCAR loses this antitrust suit, it could affect all racing in this country adversely, because it mentions in the original complaint about spec parts and pieces. And, every racing series in this country is privately owned. It's not governed the way the NBA is or the NFL is. And the situation is, the reason they instituted spec engines and spec cars and all was to reduce the cost. So if that gets thrown out to where you can't have spec racing anymore, well, look at IndyCar, look at what's in NASCAR. These little tracks that are trying desperately to hang on and survive won't be able to make rules governing spec engines and all to help reduce the cost for the competitors.
So, Deb, I got to share something with the people that are watching this, and I think they'll love this story. When you said a moment ago that Lee Spencer had talked to you when you got the award and said that you dedicated your life to the sport, I got to tell people, when we used to do our weekday show on Sirius XM, there were a couple times when people had called up and they had said something and or asked a question. I said, you know what? I need to find that answer, and I'll find that answer for you. And guess what? I got a text on my phone right away from Deb Williams, and it said the answer to the question. And so I could say, look, guys, here you go. I got it from an authority right now for you, that we have this information for you. Deb, that's dedication. And by the way, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I always appreciate it.
I don't know what it was, but you're welcome.
I forget exactly what it was, Deb, but there are a couple of things. So I said, guys, I don't know. And then all of a sudden my phone would buzz, and it was Deb. And we certainly do appreciate that.
I do that to Dave Moody a lot, and Danielle Trotta too. Sometimes I'll do it to Bagley.
And we appreciate it. It's great help. But again, it's you paying attention, Deb, to what's going on. And I think people don't pay attention to what's going on these days. Like our old buddy Larry Mack says, don't cost a dime to pay attention. But I think when people do pay attention to their craft, when they are dedicated to their craft, great things do happen. But overall, Deb, when you look at this, I know there's things going on behind the scenes legally, but really I think this year, when you look at the butts that are in the seats, the pairs of eyes that are on the TV. Yes, sponsors come and go, and some big ones have left recently. But what's your overall take, Deb, with your experience and being right next to this sport for so long? Where does it stand right now? Is it in good shape?
I felt really good about it until the lawsuit got filed, and now everything is up in the air again, because, as the judge said on Thursday, we won't know what 2026 looks like until this lawsuit is settled, until the jury makes a decision. He said, if the plaintiffs, meaning 2311 and Front Row Motorsports, wins, NASCAR is going to look very different in 2026 than what it does now. But if the defendants, i.e. NASCAR, win, we know what 2026 is going to look like. I think the sponsors are coming back now. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that where the seats are covered up some places, those are now sold as billboards where the sponsors are. I also don't think a lot of people realize that the reason a lot of the seats were taken down is because I know in North Carolina there's a seat tax. So you've got to pay a tax on every seat you have at that stadium. So if you're not selling them, it only makes sense to take them down and sell trackside places for the motorhomes, because you're already paying property tax on that land anyway. So you could say that renting out a motorhome trackside is in a sense gravy, because you've already paid the property tax on the property that the motorhome's parked on. So tracks are, they overbuilt. Let's face it, they overbuilt in the 90s when NASCAR was like a runaway train. And then NASCAR kind of got off the rails a little bit with the dog being competition and the tail being marketing, and the tail started wagging the dog for about 20 years. We lost a generation of fans, and now they've got it back on the track, and the competition, the dog's wagging the tail again. So, I feel good about the sport. I feel really good about the situation it's in, but I do have a little bit of a lump in my throat regarding this lawsuit.
So, Deb, I know everything we do is not completely positive. Sometimes you do have to report on things like the lawsuit or some things that are going to be negative with people that we consider friends. Was there some situations along the way for you in your career that you had to do that you had to report a story that was either derogatory or negative about a competitor that you see week in and week out? I know that's one of the tougher things about NASCAR. Everybody competes at the same venue week in and week out. It's not like the NFL where you're scattered all over the country. You have to see these people, and that's a tough part. Were you ever faced with that to where you had to report a story that was probably going to get you maybe in a little bit of hot water with a competitor?
Well, I won't say hot water, but I will say that the one that always stands out in my mind was when Richard Petty got caught with the oversized engine and the left side tires on the right side after he won the fall race at Charlotte in 1983. And that's the one that really stands out in my mind as being, I would say that's when I truly went from fan to journalist, was when I had to cover that story. But that's the one that really stands out in my mind. The others, Rusty Wallace wasn't happy when I was covering his lawsuit against Raymond Beadle. He didn't like some of the things that was written, and I told him, I said, well, if you didn't want something public, your attorney should have sealed it. And he said, you mean he can do that? I said, yeah, he should have told you that. So then the anger transferred to the attorney from me. But as far as, actually, I always try, I'm a conservative journalist. I don't do yellow journalism, and I just wasn't trained that way. I don't feel comfortable with it. So I'm the type person that when I write a story, I want to make sure I've got everything that if I have to go to court, I'll win. And otherwise, I don't just throw things out there.
Well, Deb, that's probably one of the reasons that we're having this discussion like we're having right now about your being the recipient of that Ken Squire Hall of Fame award. I think sometimes when we hear about colleagues, we might say, that person, yeah, they did this or got this honor or anything. Across the board here, Deb, people are just saying what a well-deserved honor. That was the first thing that came to my mind. And I want to congratulate you once again, and I hope there's many, many more years of your career in front of you. But I think this is such an affirmation right now of what you've been able to do and the respect you have with your colleagues. Just congratulations. It's really, this is a very good, happy story to talk about.
Thank you. I appreciate it tremendously. It means a great deal to me.
All right, Deb, well, I thank you for your time. Great talk,
Thank
and
you.
hope to see you very soon.
I hope so. Take care.